what it ends up coming down to as a coach, people like this, or just any natural bodybuilder for that matter, you're managing fatigue and you're managing emotions while going through that process. Because when you think about supply and demand, when you're powerlifting, you're usually well fed, unless you're trying to make a weight class because you do a little dieting. But if you're strategic, you're managing the fatigue, you're managing the demand, you should be able to perform really well leading into an event. But with bodybuilding, you get to some really extreme levels of body fat. Like, so your demand is really high, but you don't have the same supply.
Hey everyone, if you like the Fitness Daily, just know that it's brought to you by Zor Fitness. At Zor Fitness, we offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for athletes and coaches. You can find it all in one place, zorfitness.com. Hey everyone, thank you for listening in to the Fitness Daily. Today I'll be talking to natural bodybuilder and coach Jeff Alberts. You've probably heard about him since he's been around the block for a while, and especially in the natural bodybuilding community and bodybuilding as a whole. 3DMJ is his coaching business, so I'll let him give his introduction because I know he has a lot of background and all that. So, Jeff, if you want to take the floor and just take it away with your
Wow.
background.
Yeah, where do I start? So, I mean, I started lifting back in 1986 and haven't stopped since. So I've been going at it for quite a while. I'm a dad first and foremost, and husband. And of course, the natural bodybuilder comes out in me. But yeah, I've been coaching for 15 years, competing for 30. So yeah, there's a lot I can probably share. So I'll just let you just pick my brain and we'll go at it.
Perfect. First thing I'm curious about, you mentioned you've been competing for 30 years. When was your last competition?
Last year, I did
Last year.
WMF Worlds
Okay.
in November. So
Okay.
it's still doing it on a high level. So still top
Yeah,
five in the open divisions, even at 52.
that's wild. Yeah,
So
and for those who are listening, and if you don't follow Jeff, I recommend going to his Instagram and checking it out. He's pretty insane physique. You could definitely tell he's put in a lot of years of doing this, because you don't get a physique like that naturally in just a few months of training bodybuilding or a few years. That takes
that's true.
a
Yeah.
while to build. Yeah. And so you've been training, doing this bodybuilding thing for years on years. When did you start coaching?
It was 2010 when we first started 3D Muscle Journey. And back then when we first started, we said, hey, let's just open this up to two athletes and give them a sponsorship. So
Yeah.
we weren't getting paid, just get some experience. And then from there, it kind of just kept growing. It just kept growing and growing and growing organically. And here we are 15 years later.
Yeah.
But yeah, back when we first started, it was 2009. I was competing because I took like a 2 or 3 year layoff. And I was a little burned out at that point. And I was like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. But I changed perspective because prior to that, I was very competitive. It was either win or nothing else. And I just got fizzled out because, I didn't get my pro card at all. And like, forget this. So long story short, I came back in 2009, different perspective, different mindset. Like, I'm just going to do this for fun. And it's about the journey. So that's why I named 3D Muscle Journey, 3D Muscle Journey, because it's more about the journey. And then, of course, having a different perspective with that competition season of just trying to have fun, it allowed me to open myself up when I was actually at the competitions because of that competitiveness. It was almost like I don't want to talk to nobody because I'm here to win. I'm here for business. So just different perspective, different shift in mindset, and met the other coaches at 3D Muscle Journey, and then the rest is history.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
How
just
many of you guys are there now?
we have there's five of us. There's three of us that coach full time. There's myself, Alberto Nunez, actually four of us, Brad Loomis and Brian Minor. And then Eric Counts, of course, is one of the leading researchers out there. He
Yeah.
doesn't coach too much anymore, but he's still like all the information he provides. He's a great resource for us to keep bettering ourselves. And then of course we have a few people on the back end that kind of helps out as well. So We started out as a four-man team, and then now we've been up to, I think, 9 or 10 total as far as our total company.
That's awesome. So I'm curious because I know you have Eric on the team who's big on the research side of things. How
Mhm.
has your training from both your experience and all your years of experience, all your years of coaching, and then you have resources that are in more of the research field, how has your coaching and training style changed from the beginning to now?
Yeah. So my training experience prior to meeting the other coaches, and I wasn't really into the science back then because back then there was no internet, none of that. So
Right.
I think my first introduction to a really regimented program was Mike Mintzer's HIT. There was a guy at the gym introduced me to it. So I got embedded in that camp for about 18 years. I ran a modified version of it. I didn't run it exactly like Mike Mintzer said, because basically the training frequency for the way he was kind of just prescribing, I was like, hit like training once every 4 or 5 days, 6 days. I'm like, that's just way too long for me to be away from the gym. Like I'll
Hmm.
go crazy if I'm not in the gym. I got to be in there at least 3 times a week. So I was training 3 days per week, low volume, high intensity, and it worked well. I made some gains and it fueled me for 18 years. But then once I met the other guys, I was like, well, why don't you try some of these other things? Why don't you do a little more volume? Why don't you use rest and reserve and, use these different types of tools? And because I was so ingrained in that first style of training for 18 years, you get a little dogmatic and you also get a little defensive because your identity's tied to that style of training. Like it's hardcore, you're going to failure on everything. So it's hard for me to bring walls down when it's like, hey, why don't you try these things? So eventually, I came around, started listening a little more and started to slowly implement some of these ideas. I'm like, hey, that actually worked pretty well. So
Yeah.
it's like eventually just the walls came down and I just learned since then, we're talking 15 years now, that you can use anything to your advantage if the context calls for it. So the mindset isn't black or white anymore. It's like it's the shades of gray, or in a sense, like having a big toolbox now. So I look at it now. Like I got this huge toolbox. Hit training just that's just a tool. Let me tuck it away in the toolbox.
Yeah.
Okay, high volume, that's a tool. Let me put that in there. And then you can go with the diet, types of cardio, like all these different types of modalities, like learn about them, experience them, and then you'll start to learn like what works, what doesn't work based on specific context.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the style I coach now. It's more like, okay, here's these shining objects that science is kind of saying like these might help us, but I don't look at it as like the end all be all. Like I have to implement these things. Like let me experiment with it, see what it does, and then okay, when the context calls for it, I'll pull it out. But 9 times out of 10, when I get on, like when I meet up with a first time athlete, you learn their life. Like if you're asking questions, you learn their life context. More times than not, like all these things you see on social media, it's like, most of it you can't really implement it. And it's
Yeah.
removing white noise. That's what I do a lot of those. I remove the noise because, someone new to the field, whether it's, bodybuilding or whatever, they're gonna shining new objects. Like, ooh, let me jump on that. A month later, let me jump on that. So they never really find to any type of good structure and good consistency. And it comes down to like more of the principles. So I just remove a lot of things, get people centered, get a good, of course, the program is based on scientific principles, but it has to jive well with someone's life context.
Yeah. I definitely like that a lot. I think there's a lot of new information coming out in the research side of things, a lot of new techniques and different ways of training. I'm sure you've heard of the big thing now is like long length partials, and everyone's hopping on that, and they have their own um opinion on that, and just looking at it as like you have to look at the whole picture, right? And
Yeah.
the consistency you mentioned is definitely one thing. Um, that I have found to be one of the biggest variables that needs to be nailed down.
You got to figure out what your baseline is. Like whatever
Yeah.
you doing? What's the baseline? So like, let's say you're okay, I'm going to start doing these partials. Let's say, for example, on a specific movement, it hurts to be in that stretch position. There's a little bit of aches and pains. Like it's not optimal if you have aches and pains because you're not going to be able to perform that well. You're not going to be
Yeah.
motivated to train either because of the pain. Okay, what if you stop short of that? Let's say you're training with 2/3 of the range of motion. It's more towards the top. Like that's its own baseline. And from that baseline, what's the goal? It's the same as any other baseline you're working with is to elevate your performance, whether that's load, reps, sets, whatever it is, you're always trying to elevate baseline. And it's easier for me to kind of say these things because I'm like 38 years into training. And I know a lot of this stuff is just it's like minutia. So whether like, okay, maybe even if let's say we throw a percentage out there. So let's say 5%, you're gonna get more gains if you're in this fully stretched position. But if your aches and pains, they're building up 6 months later, you might have gotten a nice jump for 6 months, but then here I am slowly starting to pass you by because I'm doing what I can do without any pain. There's no constraints in a sense. So even though I'm moving a little slower, eventually I get to where I want to go. And that's why at 52, 53 now, like I'm still training on a decently high level and still doing well on the competitive side of things.
Yeah.
That's kind of how my brain just looks at things. Like I don't get too caught up in the weeds too much. And I don't, because of how I used to be in my early days of being really ingrained in a specific camp and defending specific camps. Like I'm like, now I'm on the outside looking in, going like, okay, you guys are arguing over just little things when you guys could be taking both sides and really using it to your advantage.
Yeah. I know, sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background. I've tried to mute it while you're talking,
Yeah,
so
I
it's
like
not
dogs.
background. Um, so mentioning the whole consistency thing and that you've seen a lot of people kind of switch their training up a little bit too early because they see this new shiny object come up and they're like, I want to try that. Um, what
Like your
are
dog
some
seeing a squirrel, right? Your dog seeing a
exactly
squirrel, it's like, ooh,
any moving object that walks by,
yep.
he's going crazy. And that's how I find a lot of people are in general, right? Oh, there's this new technique out. Oh, there's this new piece of equipment. I want to try that.
Yep.
Oh, I read about this. I saw it on Instagram. Um, what are some like big pitfalls that you see when someone wants to build muscle? So they come to you and they're like, "Hey, Jeff, I really want to be a competitive bodybuilder. I've been struggling with XYZ." And you start working with them for, let's say, a few months, so you have a good basis of them as an athlete. What are some of the big pitfalls you see with that, with them
Lack of
typically?
patience.
Lack of
Lack of
patience.
patience.
Yeah.
Because I mean, everybody wants to be jacked in 2 months, 3 months.
Yeah.
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 Or they're looking at everything on Instagram, which looks, it's interesting because I've been observing from afar as of late, because I haven't been posting as much lately. And almost every post I see, it's someone who's like really jacked or really elite, or even like on the natural bodybuilding side of things, people are just showing the winners per se, and not really showing like someone who maybe came in second to last or maybe fourth place. Like, so the way I look at it, there's levels to this. So
Mhm.
when I go to my son's karate class, there's white belts, yellow belts, blue belts, red belts. He's a brown belt, or no, he's actually red black now. He's like maybe a little less than a year away from getting a black. He had to start at white belt.
Yeah.
So it's like when I get an athlete, I kind of have to assess where they at. Are they a white belt or are they more closer to a black belt? So if they're a white belt, I have to coach them as if they're a white belt. I can't coach them as if they're a black belt. And that's what's frustrating sometimes as a coach. Sometimes people expect to be coached a certain way or they expect results to come at a certain time frame. But the reality is you're white, the next level is yellow, not black. So it's patience and there's a process to it. And that's how I coach. It just
Yeah.
depends on where that athlete is. It's like, okay, from that point, that's how I'm going to start coaching. So it can be a 2 month process. It could be 2 years, it could be 5 years. It kind of just depends on where they're at.
Yeah. Interesting. So when you coach someone, how do you assess where they're at? Like, what are the things that you're looking at? Because I know with let's say powerlifting, you have a baseline pretty straight away of, you see how they move when they do a squat, bench, deadlift, and you know their numbers, their 1 rep max and all that.
But
And then CrossFit, we have a few baseline tests, right? Like, oh, how fast do you finish this standard workout? What's your max clean and jerk and all these other numbers. For
Yeah.
bodybuilding, what are like baseline things that you look at?
I mean, the first thing that stands out, right, is the physique.
Yeah.
That's what probably where everybody's going to go. Like, you got to assess the physique. But I've come across people who are just genetically gifted. They have amazing physiques. Like, you see 20-year-old with the physique of a 40-year-old, but the mentality is not a 40-year-old mentality. Sometimes it's a 20-year-old mentality. The maturity level is not there. So you can't coach as if they're 40. It's like they still, because there's the physical has to grow, the mental and the emotional all has to grow as well. So you have to take all those things into consideration. So it's not just like what's on surface level. And I think that's where, a lot of us will say, hey, this person's beginner, intermediate, or advanced. When I look at an advanced bodybuilder, it's like, yes, okay, the physique should look advanced, but also how their mentality, their maturity level, and actually their knowledge too, and how they're capable of like making in the moment decisions. Like if you're in the weight room, it's like, if something is hurting, do I just push through it, or am I mature enough to back off and like, okay, let me just walk out of the gym today and I'll come back tomorrow when I'm a little bit more on point. So that to me is more advanced bodybuilding than, like what you look like.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
stuff I do all the time. Like in my Instagram posts, it's just, I kind of talk about in a sense, like how I auto regulate things on the fly.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed that. There's a like on the captions, you're always it's kind of like a little diary in a way,
Yeah.
where you kind of talk about how you're feeling and all that and how do you have to auto-regulate. So with that, because I know you mentioned reps in reserve, is
Mhm.
that one of the prescriptions that you like to give athletes on their program, or do you use RPE percentages?
It's fairly the same thing, just different
Yeah.
terminology. But I mean, if we look at the rep ranges, that's more like we look from a principle perspective. So we know we can create hypertrophy anywhere between 5 to 30 reps, thanks to the science, right? That's where we
Yeah.
kind of look at those tools, like, okay, I'm going to use this. But when you're on the lower end of the rep ranges, because the load is heavier, you don't have to be as close to failure. So 1 to 2 in the tank, 3 in the tank, you're probably getting a stimulus. And then the higher rep ranges, if you're 15 or above, it's like the load is so light, half of that set, you're like, this doesn't feel like I'm doing anything. It's not until you get to the end of the set where it's like, okay, this is hard. Then you have to make sure you're going to failure to ensure you're recruiting plenty of muscle fiber. So from that perspective, that's where I'm kind of looking at. So I'm not really like too focused on specific rep ranges and things like that. Like, let's say you walked into the weight room and you had no prescription, like no one gave you a rep target. So instinctually, I think you're like, okay, if I need to get a stimulus, I'm going to make it hard.
Yeah.
You're going to push yourself as hard as you could. So I don't get myself too attached to numbers per se at this point. So if I know if I'm, let's say, in that ballpark of 8 to 12 reps, I'm like, okay, I'm going to get at least one in the tank, maybe two. Failure on occasion, and usually with failure, maybe the last set only. So I don't, like the first set, if you go to failure, then it's gonna be harder to recover for the next set. So you might not get as much performance out of those sets. So that last set, I'm pushing a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So with specific athletes, like if I know it's someone who's fairly new, chances are they don't really know how to gauge that too well. So I might tell them, say, I need 8 to 10 reps here. And if it's a safer exercise, I'm saying on the last set, I want you to go to failure. And then I'll actually have them record it so I can see if they're actually going to failure or not. But it gets them closer to knowing how to gauge those reps in reserve because they're actually testing themselves. Whereas if I said, hey, I want you to do 8 to 10 reps, but I want you to lead 3 in the tank, it's almost like, what's 3 in the tank? Like even me trained 38 years, sometimes I don't have a hard time knowing what 3 in the tank is or 4.
Yeah.
1 to 2, it's a little bit easier. Failure, that's a lot easier. So I'm just here going for broke.
Yeah. For sure. And so do you find that difficult with people who kind of push themselves a little bit too much, right? Because there's people who either don't push themselves enough, very few are pretty good, and then there's the opposite end where people
Wrecking
push
themselves.
themselves, yeah, wreck
Yep.
themselves. If you don't dig yourself in a hole, you didn't do it right. That type of mentality. How do you manage those type of people?
It's usually lower volume.
Lower volume.
That's one. Because
Yeah.
it's hard to tell people don't. go to failure as often
Yeah.
because there's like my like that was me with HIIT. My mentality is like I gotta go hard or I go home. So if someone told me I need you to do two in the tank, I'm like, yeah, that ain't happening. But if someone told me, hey, okay, you're gonna go from three sets down to two, that's okay. But I still get to train hard. Okay, okay, I think I can. That's a good compromise.
Okay.
And when I prescribe deloads, that's 9 times out of 10, that's how I'm going to do people's deloads. Because as bodybuilders, most bodybuilders, they want to get after it. So if you tell them for a whole week, I want you to leave, 4 in the tank. I want you to lower your loads down. It's like most people are going to go, why am I even here? This is boring. Like
Yeah.
I'll just rather just take a whole week off and do this.
Right.
Usually, like I'll do is like, okay, if they're let's say they're doing their baseline's 3 sets and exercise, take it down to two. Still train hard, still train as if you're trying to progress, but just do 2 sets only.
Okay.
So if you're, let's say your typical workout is 20, 21 sets in a session, well, now you're doing maybe 14. That's a big drop off in volume. So the demand goes down. So in
Mm.
theory, anyways, you should be able to recover better from that. And
Right.
we'll get the goal accomplished as far as bringing down the fatigue levels with that deload.
Yeah.
It's just mentally more engaged with that.
Yeah.
Even going from 2 sets to one, if you still get to just go at it. And what happens is you're focused because it's not here anymore, it's here. So the demand quite possibly could even go up higher because now you're pushing yourself even harder because you know you only have 2 sets instead of three. I've seen that happen too.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that approach. Just because I think the standard deload most people do is like you go in and it feels like you're doing nothing.
Right? Like
Um,
you're
uh,
doing warm-up sets. But
exactly. And
if it's me, I'm like, you know what? Instead of I'm just gonna take the whole week off, or I'm just gonna go in twice this week and just train hard, and I'll have five
yeah,
rest days.
yeah. I'm the same way. Like it kind of bothers me. Like I'm just like, I just feel like I wasted my time. I could have just done something a little bit more productive.
I'd rather go watch a movie than do this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I like that approach though. Right, because any little change you take a set if they're going to failure, you take from two to three, like you said, within the whole session, like that brings volume down pretty big.
Yeah.
Um, so
Keeps you more mentally engaged because you get to push yourself. You get to
yeah,
say, oh, I did 8 reps, so I can now see if I can do 9. You still get to do
yeah,
those things, but you're just not doing as much whole work.
yeah. Um, do you work with anyone who's kind of I know the new term now is hybrid, right? But do you work with anyone who
That's
does
catching fire, huh? Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. But do you work with anyone who's like into bodybuilding, but they're doing also something else, whether that's cycling or some other activity that kind of
Mhm.
has an interference with bodybuilding?
Yeah, I prepped one guy I think last year, the year before. He wanted to do a bodybuilding show, but at the same time, like triathlons, powerlift, like all this stuff. I'm like, I don't think I'm capable of like, because I've never done it before. So I'm not gonna say, yeah, I'm gonna take you and just we're gonna do all these things at once because I don't have enough experience with that. So I said, hey, if you want to do the bodybuilding thing, prep, and then after that, you transition to those things, I'm good with it. So he was okay with that. But yeah,
Okay.
I just don't have enough knowledge to like I'll work with people who do like maybe some, jujitsu. They're doing that 2 or 3 times a week. It's more recreation type stuff. Like I
Hmm.
know how to manage the supply and demand, but we're talking about high level competition stuff. I'm just not that type of coach. Like my expertise is natural bodybuilding.
Yeah.
So I kind of stay in my lane. So if someone came to me and said, hey, I want to do these two things at once on a high level, I'm like, that's not going to be me.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I've had plenty of like, I've had like jujitsu. I've had people have done, what do you call it? Mixed martial arts, competitive fighting, that type of thing. So I have worked with athletes doing hybrid stuff like that, but not like,
Mhm.
hey, I'm getting you ready for a fight and we're going to make sure you're making the weight and all this. It's like, no, that's
Yeah.
not my area of expertise.
Yeah. And so I know before we started this conversation, I mentioned to you that I did bodybuilding a few years ago. And I competed in NPC, sorry.
Hmm.
NPC, I did 3 shows. I didn't do, I was going to do an OCB show. Um, but by the time it came around, I was pretty worn out. I think I was in prep for too long. Like I was very lean and for a little too long. I didn't take a good break in between. Instead, I just kept like grinding.
Hmm.
Um, so as a natural bodybuilder, and let's say someone who does has a long competitive season, let's say they have a show, one like let's say in April, and then they have another one like in August. So there's this big gap. How do you approach that from a training perspective and a nutrition perspective? Because obviously staying that lean for that long is not
Hmm.
fun.
I have an athlete right now. We're getting ready for Worlds, and he competed in July, got his pro card, wants to do Worlds. A long gap going from July
Yeah.
all the way to November. So once we finished that show in July, it was pretty much diet for. I actually gained 2 kilos back. It's like 5 or 6 pounds. We gained that back, and then we had a holding pattern for about 2 months. And then the last stretch, we're like, okay, now we're going to get back into, the deficit and get you back down and grind for Worlds. So I've done that stretch from July to November. I did that in 2019. It was a very long stretch, and the mistake I made was doing shows the whole time. It wasn't planned though. Like I had a show in July. I'm like, oh, there's a show in 3 weeks. I'll do that one.
Like
And then
I'm
I was like,
already
oh, there's
ready
another
for
one
it.
here, another. So yeah, I just kept going. I did pretty well up until September to fade out. Like you can tell my physique started to look flat, tired. So it was just too much. It was too long. So year, I'm gonna say, okay, we're gonna try to find shows that are within a 2 or 3 month window because if you're staying as experience this when you're lean for a long period of time, it's really rough.
Yeah.
Physically demanding, mentally it's demanding, emotionally it's demanding, and not just on us, but the people who are around us, wives, husbands. Like, man, you haven't gone out to eat with us for like 6 months. So it's just really it's really a tough ask to go that long.
Yeah. Yeah, for
And,
sure.
and I
I'm
tell you this, the athlete that's going to Worlds now, like, okay, you're 2 or 3 year off season now. You need a break. You need to recover because it's not just July to November because we started dieting in the early part of the year. So it's almost a full year of being like in this process.
yeah.
It's a long stretch.
It's a long stretch. And I just remember like yeah, you like because I started my first show in April and I started the November leading up to that. So I started like around Thanksgiving. So
Hmm.
Thanksgiving, I
Got your
tried to
turkey in it, you got your pie.
yeah,
Okay, now we're going.
yep, exactly. And then from then on, like, Christmas, like missing out like on I tried to stay on track in Christmas and all those holidays, New Year's, and then all that, missing out time with eating out with family and friends, like you were mentioning. It definitely takes a toll for sure. And I think like most competitive sports, right? There's like the stressors that come along with it. Bodybuilding's an interesting one. And I think natural bodybuilding, especially because you have to fine tune a lot of variables. So when just for background, like I did bodybuilding and then I transitioned a little bit into like powerlifting and CrossFit. Um, Definitely, I think I had a mentality too where I was like, "Ah, I got to stay lean because like I
Mm.
had still had that bodybuilding mentality going into there, and that was
Like the aesthetics. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So that was very difficult. Do you find that a lot with people coming maybe either have the opposite problem or have like the aesthetics part of it if they're coming from like powerlifting or another sport and they want to do bodybuilding? Um, like do you find that the mentality of bodybuilding kind of gets to them at all if they're training?
If they're inexperienced with bodybuilding, what I get people coming from powerlifting is oftentimes it's because of injuries. Like they just can't keep up with the powerlifting. So it's like, oh, let me do bodybuilding.
Yeah.
And they go to bodybuilding and they realize, oh, I got to start dieting.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this competition. Okay, now I'm changing my lifestyle big time. And that can be kind of a shock when if you're eating a lot of food for performance and now all of a sudden your food gets slashed, you're like, now I got to try to maintain performance with less food. Like there's a huge demand with that. And what it ends up coming down to as a coach, people like this, or just any natural bodybuilder for that matter, you're managing fatigue and you're managing emotions while going through that process. Because when you think about supply and demand, when you're powerlifting, you're usually well fed, unless you're trying to make a weight class because you do a little dieting. But if you're strategic, you're managing the fatigue, you're managing the demand. You should be able to perform really well leading into an event. But with bodybuilding, you get to some really extreme levels of body fat, like just really low. So your demand is really high, but you don't have the same supply. So how do you keep performance up? How do you keep the recovery up? And it comes down to just again managing like the timeline because the
Yeah.
more time you give yourself, the least invasive the process is going to be. And that's a concept some people have a hard time dealing with. Like, what do you mean I'm going to diet for 6 months? They hear 6 months or they hear 9 months. They think, oh, that's 6 months, 9 months of agony. But if you're removing the same body weight in, let's say, 4 months, that 4 months is going to be a lot more like hell than the 6 to 9 months of going more conservatively. So it's really organizing the timeline. That's what's really key. And just making sure like people, you give them the like what to expect. Someone's never gone through the process. You have to kind of lay it all out. Okay, this is probably what's going to feel like in the beginning. This is what it's going to be like in the middle. This is probably what it's going to be like towards the end. And now we got to think about when you come out of it, it's probably going to be even harder coming out of it than actually dieting
Yeah.
because you're used to a certain look now. Like and life has been this way for sometimes a year. And all of a sudden you don't know what normal is anymore. So once the show's over with, it's like you're eating more food, but yet you're gaining all this weight. It's hard to deal with that mentally. To see your body all of a sudden kind of go the opposite direction. So there could be a struggle coming out of it more for people than actually doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I
What was
remember
your
hearing
experience
that a
coming out of
lot.
it? What was your
Yeah,
experience coming out of it?
it was very much that, right? Like I is like, oh man, like you're so lean for a period. I know I was lean, like I mentioned, I was a little bit too
Mhm.
lean for too long. So it was kind of like scary towards the end, like, oh crap, like, no, I want to keep eating a certain way. I want to keep training this way. I want to keep my cardio was high at that point, the weeks leading into my last show. And I wanted to keep all of that, like,
Looks
but
cool, right? You're like, this
yeah,
looks cool. It's like
yeah,
I look
like
great. Don't feel
my,
great sometimes,
yeah.
but it looks great.
Felt like trash, but I was so vascular and stuff. I was like, this is awesome. Like,
Hmm.
so it definitely took a while, but I was lucky that I had a good support system, like my sister, my spouse, and all that. So, um, eventually, like it was an easier transition because I had that.
Yeah.
Versus like if I was living on my own and all that, I probably would have grinded a little bit too long, and I don't know
Hmm.
where that would have led to.
Yeah, because sometimes people they coming out of it, you probably heard of reverse dieting,
Yeah.
which is like, I don't know, when you're like that depleted out, and then it's like, oh, okay, this week I get to eat 100 extra calories, and you have no more hyper focused goal there to keep you locked in.
Hmm.
It's easy to kind of just like you end up seeing them on a binging and that type of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it can be pretty rough. That's why usually when the show's over with, it's like, okay, I need you to go out and have a good time with your family, eat some food, do that for a day or two, and then let's get back to some structure. And it's like, okay, we're just going to eat X amount of calories higher than where you were. Try to maintain the same type of habits. And if we are doing a lot of activity, let's cut that at least in half
Yeah.
because you need recovery at that point. If we're talking 6% body fat, 7%, 5%, sometimes people go lower than that. Like you need recovery. Like you need food, you need some rest, and shiny new object syndrome, right? We come off a show
Yeah.
like, oh, I want to try that new training program, and you try to double down your volume and all this, and it's like you're still in a not a great place. Like you're still in a very deprived state. So you're better off like, yeah, let's take a week off of training maybe, or hey, just go in there and just move some weight around and let's make sure you're eating to recover. And part of the recovery is not just your body, but mentally and emotionally. And also the people, again, the people around you, like they want to take you out to eat. Like let them. Doesn't mean
Yeah.
you have to go crazy, but let them enjoy you again because obviously you lived a different lifestyle for a year.
Yeah. And it's like you're talking through this, right? And it's all like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Mhm.
But when someone's in that mindset and let's say they don't have a coach, none of that makes sense. It's very much like, no, I want to
No,
keep this
it
going.
sounds rational, right?
Yeah, Yeah.
It's like my son. I can tell him till I'm blue in the face, don't do that. He does
Yeah.
it anyway, but once he does, he's like, oh, okay, now I know what he was talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So I definitely think especially in bodybuilding, like coaches are essential for sure. Keep you
They
in check.
help, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get bashed a little bit. Like, why do you need a coach? People don't need coaches. It's like, well, you look at any other sports out there. In football, there's a head coach, you got offensive
Yeah.
coordinators, defensive co like all these people that try to help make you a better athlete.
Yeah. Exactly. Give you that different perspective and
Mhm.
expertise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious, are you someone, I know you post a lot of videos of your training and you have a home gym, correct?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you prefer like for yourself or for your athletes to do more machines or free weights? Like what do you gravitate more towards?
Both,
Both.
whatever doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
It's like if it feels com so when it comes to exercise selection, whether it's machines, barbells, dumbbells, whatever, I look at it as okay, of course, what muscle am I trying to target? That's a given. Let me make sure that exercise hits that. Mind muscle connection, meaning like I can groove that really well, actually feel what I want to feel. Is it
Hmm.
safe? Is it comfortable? And do I enjoy doing it? And if all those check out, it's a good exercise, regardless of what anybody else says.
Yeah.
So you might tell me, hey, Jeff, this exercise is the most optimal exercise. I'm like, maybe.
Maybe.
So oftentimes when people are like consuming content, if someone's being very concrete, coming across concrete, it's like maybe that is an optimal exercise. If all the criteria I just mentioned for myself checks out. If it doesn't, if one of those variables is off, then I'm going to find something else that I can really groove on.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how that's like, in a sense, that's being more practical and it's leading to more sustainability.
Yeah.
And it's hard for someone who's new because they don't really have any concepts of like what feels good. So you have to absorb it and then again explore. And that people are so afraid to explore because everybody wants everyone wants someone to tell them the answer up front. It's the questions I always get. Give me the answer. Like
Yeah.
no one gave me the answer when I started out because we didn't have the internet. I had to actually go through some trial and error. Some things worked well, some things didn't work well. Eventually you start evolving and you start to develop critical thinking skills for yourself because you are being open-minded, because you are exploring, you get to see what works and doesn't work. So when I coach from that philosophy. I might say,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to try this movement, but I want your feedback. So like when I watch a form video, it's not just me watching a form video, it's me listening to what they tell me, what they're feeling while doing it. So it might look great, their form might look solid, but they might be feeling something completely different.
Mm.
So I have to look at all those variables and try to help them figure out what works well for them. And eventually what ends up happening over time is, thanks for your help, Jeff. I got this. Because now I know how to implement things and to assess it and then make changes. And you'll evolve. Like the way I train now, 52 is much different than at 53, much different than when I was 23. I can get away with a lot more stuff because my body was a lot more pliable back then,
Yeah.
whereas now not so much.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's
You won't see me squatting 400 pounds anymore.
right. Yeah.
My
Yeah.
lower back's be like, what are you doing?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's funny that you mentioned like, some people want some concrete answers. And I get that a lot with some of the athletes that I work with where they'll ask like, "Hey, is this right?" And like I look at them squat, it looks right. And then but my first question is, does it feel good? Like you squat,
Yeah,
like in my eyes, it looks right. It may look a little different than the
yeah,
person next to you because they're built differently, like different limb lengths and all that. But does it feel good?
yeah.
And they're
It
like,
could be
yeah,
the opposite too. You look at someone's scar, you're like, oh, that looks, yeah. And
yeah,
they're like,
yeah,
that feels awesome. Feels great.
yeah. And then at that
It's
point, I'm
kind of like
like,
you look at like the analogy I like to use, like NBA basketball, right? Like you watch Steph Curry shoot a free throw, flawless technique, right? You look at like Rick Barry, I don't know, probably Rick Barry is probably dating this, but he used to shoot granny style. This guy from the 70s and 80s shoot granny style, underhand. They had almost identical free throw percentages. So you look at Rick Barry, you're like, man, that just looks totally off. That looks so wrong, but
yeah,
yet it's so right because it grooves again. Like safe and comfortable, mind muscle
Yeah.
connection, like all those things I mentioned. It's like
Yeah.
everything's checking off the list.
Yeah. Exactly. That's funny. I have to
That's
look
why
up
it's
who that
important, like you
is.
said, you got to ask, like, how does that feel?
Yeah. Yeah.
What are you experiencing with that? Any pain? Or hey, let's try to move your hands in an inch. Or what does that feel like? Does it feel any better? So you kind of just go back and forth. I do that all the time too. Like sometimes it's not so much like exercise selection. It could be like how I execute the movement while it's happening. Like a car in a sense. Like, you're always kind of like throttling, you got traffic in front of you, you're going a little faster, you let off the gas a little slower, apply the brakes, you feel the road, let me avoid this little speed bump or something. It's the same thing when I'm training. Like if I'm doing, let's say, a flat press and my shoulder's hurting a little bit, I might just shift my elbow in just slightly.
Yeah.
Then the pain goes away. So I'm doing those things all the time in the moment, but it's hard to really talk and share about those things on Instagram. It's like, otherwise your caption is going to be like 3,000 words.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I had a question about kind of how you approach the programming side of it and the dieting side of it. So I know um with like strength and conditioning, one of the biggest things they always talk about is periodization. Usually people, and this, they do it a lot with like people who are in like field sports or something like that, where they go through an accumulation phase, a strength phase, an explosive phase, right? Like they go through this whole periodization program. And I'm curious with bodybuilding, like I personally like when I did bodybuilding, I didn't do anything like that. It was always accumulation, always progressive overload. So I'm curious, is that
Mhm.
how do you approach that programming side? And then now that I think about it, like for nutrition, do you take a periodization approach slightly? Do you
On
have
the
like
training
blocks of
side,
time?
it's on the training side, hypertrophy is pretty forgiving.
Yeah,
And the way I look at it too is from a practical standpoint, like real life perspective. I don't know what I'm going to be doing 4 weeks from now.
yeah, sure.
I might have to take my kids somewhere 3 days out of the week. I can't train 5 days a week. I might only be able to train twice. So oftentimes I'm not the way I program. I don't like, okay, I'm setting up 6 months in advance and periodizing it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to set up maybe a block, 4 to 7 weeks worth of training. And then within that, there might need to be some changes based on context. But I think of it just think of it from a week standpoint. Like, okay, how many days can a person train? Here's the questions I would ask. Like, this is what I ask my athletes, first time athlete. How many days a week can you train where it's going to work with your life schedule? So when you're in the gym, you're not stressing on the things you got to do outside. So
Hmm.
that way, when you're training, you're locked in. You're not thinking about, oh, I got to hurry up and get out of here because I got to go take my kids to school, or I got to get out of here because my wife's going to be mad because I'm in here for 2 hours. So it's like, how many days a week can you train, and how long can you train per session? Is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? Is it 45 minutes? Based on that, then I know how much work they can actually handle with good quality, where they have high efficiency. And then
Yeah.
from there, okay, now I know, okay, how many days? Okay, now I know, okay, here's where science comes in. I got to hit each body part 2 or 3 times a week. Most cases, it's going to be twice for most people, sometimes once, depending on context. So I'm like, okay, how am I going to organize this depending on how many days they're training? And then from there, I'm looking at, okay, exercise selection, because obviously a squat is more demanding than a leg press. So it's like, okay, what, okay, what's your top three quad exercises? So let's say I get top three that they can really groove on. What's the demand of those exercises? Okay, what's the hinging patterns? What's our pressing patterns? And it's like, okay, now I think about the demand of those movements. Now I'm going to organize it across the week where I'm not grouping a bunch of hard things all in one session. I'm spreading the wealth out in a sense. So that way I'm managing fatigue as best as I can. Because keep in mind, especially for competitive bodybuilders or dieting for shows, like I gotta make sure that they're recovering well, performing and recovering well. That's how I
Yeah.
kind of look at programming. I don't look at it as like, oh, like I need an accumulation phase. I need this. It's like, no, I'm trying to manage their performance and their
Hmm.
fatigue. And as bodybuilders, I think as a whole, we do a very poor job at managing supply and demand because most bodybuilders always want to do more,
Mm.
do more, do more, do more. But we look at other sports, look at baseball, basketball, football, like all these other sports, it's all about performance. In order to perform, they know they need recovery. So they do a
Yeah.
pretty good job at managing that, whereas bodybuilders always more, 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 more.
Yeah.
So like nowadays, I hardly ever look at bodybuilding to learn more about my bodybuilding. I look at other sports because they got better stranglehold on those things. So I take those principles from there and I apply it over here. It's a
Yeah.
hard sell. It's a very hard sell because you have a lot of content creators. They push certain concepts. It's very black or white, but
Hmm.
it's for me, I kind of just again, I just look outside of the world of bodybuilding. You can learn so much more.
Yeah. And so you've learned a lot about, let's say, looking at other sports regarding recovery in order to perform and fatigue management. What other things have you picked up from those
The mental side
outside?
of it too.
Yeah.
Like tennis, I watch a lot of tennis. I don't know if you watch tennis or if you know how that goes. Like if you get into a five set match and you're in the last game of the 5 set tiebreak,
Hmm.
like the mentality, you have to make sure that you're keeping your composure. It's like the end of a set, right? Like if you're grinding on the last rep or two, do you lose your form? Do you break form? Do you lose stability because you're just not keeping yourself composed?
Mm.
So those are the things I take away from the mental side is like watching how these elite level athletes perform in the toughest points of the
Yeah.
game, a match, or whatever the case may be. Like, what are they doing to make sure they're keeping their performance really high? Look at Tom Brady. He's got
Yeah.
blitzing linebackers coming from all different, but he's so cool in the pocket. He'll just slide to the left, throws a laser pass.
Yeah.
He's not like getting all like crazy. So whether you're dieting for a show and it's like you're super hungry and tired, like how do you react to that? Do you
Yeah.
let yourself get razzled and get yourself all stressed out even more? Or do you take a big deep breath and go, okay, yeah, it does suck, but could be a lot worse.
Yeah.
So how am I going to react to this? So those
Yeah.
are things. Yeah. I think that's what separates a lot of people, like a lot of high level competitive natural bodybuilders on the world level.
Hmm.
Because it's like at that point, it's more like, okay, who's getting the leanest? Who can get
Yeah.
themselves really lean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a game of suffer for sure.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like, well, what protocol you're running? It's like, no, how long can you persevere?
Yeah. Yeah. And on average, I'm curious, like from your experience, how long do people last at that competitive high level? Um,
As far as
like,
longevity, you mean?
yeah, yeah. Because I know you've been in, I think you're an anomaly where you've been in for so long. Typically, how
There's a
long
few
does,
of us. Like right now, have you ever heard of Marshall Johnson?
no.
So Google Marshall Johnson when you get a chance, and
Yeah.
he is 10 years my senior,
Okay.
and he's still one of the best natural bodybuilders out there. Like he just competed at the OCB, what is it, Yorton Cup. I think he was second there.
Okay.
He's beating guys half his age, and he's
That's crazy.
63 or 4 now.
Really?
Yeah, he's still competing on a super high level. And Kent Beerley is another guy. He's like over 60 years old, still competing like Mr. America and Yorton Cup, all these
Yeah.
high level shows and doing exceptionally well. And I think it's like obviously at our age, it's a disadvantage, I think physically. It's just naturally gets harder to keep
Yeah.
training. But mentally though, because of the experience level, the maturity level, it's actually an advantage. I always wish
Mm.
like if I had like one thing I could wish for as far as bodybuilding, give me back my 30-year-old body with my brain now.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'd be crushing it.
It'd
Yeah.
be optimal.
Yep.
That's funny. Yeah, I'll look up Marshall Johnson. I'm curious to see how he looks like and learn more a little bit about him. Um, yeah, there was one more question I wanted to ask. Um, I'm curious, like kind of going back to we mentioned in the beginning of the show where there's all this new research and all that, and you've mentioned like, hey, it just adds tools to the toolbox.
Mhm.
Um, what is something that you've learned like through your experience and not through research that you think a lot of people are missing in their journey of building more muscle?
That's a good question. I think I think just the experience side, you kind of just learn not to focus so much on minutia. Because I mean, I'm sure any field you're starting out in, you're trying to make sure everything is right. You're trying to be
Yeah.
perfect with everything. So you're focusing on these little small details that in the end probably don't matter as much as maybe we think. I mean, eventually, as you continue to go, you're like, it's more about the big rocks. It's more about practicality because we're human. We have real lives.
Hmm.
There's not too many bodybuilders that, hey, I'm making a ton of money off of these shows. Like this is my total income. So most of us have 9 to 5 jobs.
Yeah.
So it's more about like the big rocks and just finding what works well within your life context. Again, like I mentioned earlier, it's removing all that white noise, getting rid of the squirrels in a sense. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to just focus on myself, create a nice structure for myself that fits really well, and keep data. Be your own science experiment. Because if you
Yeah.
keep track of your own data and if you're very consistent with what you do, it's easier to identify what works well and what doesn't. What works well, keep it. What doesn't, change it out for something else. But only change one variable at a time, maybe two at most. Because if you got a lot of noise going on at the same time, it's like what's doing what.
Yeah.
So, and that's the main reason why I'm still going at this point. It's just in a sense I've kind of learned myself really well and I keep things fairly simple.
Yeah. I think I really like that. And I've said this multiple times. I'm sure like anyone who's listening, they've heard me say it, but I always say like I'm a very what they say boring
I was
programmer.
gonna say I'm like a very
Yeah.
boring bodybuilder. You go on my Instagram, like go back 10 because I've been on there for 10, 11 years now. It's like it's the same posts. It's like
Yeah.
it's the same boring stuff. But then you always get the questions like, how are you so jacked at 53?
And that's what
It's
it
because
is.
I focus on the boring basic stuff. I
Yeah.
got the principles down, I got the foundation down. There's
Yeah.
consistency, there's effort, commitment, all those, those things that are very cliche, but so
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. And
It's not the
I
shiny toys. It's like the length and partials isn't what created me, you know?
right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And I think everyone always wants like an answer that's kind of a little bit more flashy. And they always want a program that's flashy. And it's like you probably won't get it from me. But with consistency and all that, we'll get to wherever you need
Yeah.
to go.
One of the sayings I say a lot, I'm sure probably irritates people. I say when I first started, a barbell curl in 1986 is still a barbell curl in 2023.
Yeah,
Maybe I
exactly.
do a cable curl, maybe I do a dumbbell curl. It's the same movement pattern though.
Yeah. What's the phrase? One of my coworkers told me it when I first started working with them. It was marry the move, don't marry the exercise, marry the movement.
Yeah, it's a good
Something
saying.
like that. Yeah. So it's
Mhm.
like, you know, looking at it like that, some people think there's like you were mentioning before, that one exercise that's like the holy grail that's gonna make you the best bodybuilding builder ever or best athlete of whatever sport. And it's like it's usually the movement that you're focusing on and checking
Yeah,
off those three boxes that you mentioned.
yeah. Another thing I think about too is like if I ever feel like I'm not doing enough, then I always ask, okay, what creates atrophy? I'm like, no training at all. How long does that need to happen for? Like 3 to 5 weeks. So even if I go from 4 days a week down to two, if there's still enough effort there, muscle isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Or even miss an entire week of training. Like
Yeah.
you're not going to lose muscle. You might get a little detrained, come back, you're a little sore, what have you, but true muscle loss, it takes a lot for that to happen. So that gives me
Yeah.
peace of mind whenever I feel like I'm not doing enough. Like I just go back to that question, like, yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah. I think that's a really good one to emphasize. Yeah.
I use that on
Uh,
almost every day.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all. That's funny. No, that's a really good one, I think, to emphasize. People think it falls off, like muscles are just falling off the body. after one day of not training or a week
or
of
or
deload.
you're not progressing as fast.
Yeah.
But like again, it's easy for me with 38 years of experience. You look back and okay, yeah, I didn't need to be worried about missing a workout or two.
Yeah.
But when you're very eager and motivated to make gains, like missing a workout can seem like the end of the world.
Yeah.
When really you think about it, it's like it's a small drop in the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it was awesome. Like I said, I've been following you forever. And I've gotten a lot of things, like I've learned a lot from content that you post and the 3DMJ and your own personal page. So if someone has questions or if they want to give you a follow on Instagram or anything, where can they contact you?
3DMJ underscore Godfather on Instagram. Probably the best way to do it.
Yes, the Godfather. Yeah. All right, Jeff, thank you so much. I appreciate you and your time.
You're
And
welcome. Thank you.